Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm Abby Marsh. I'm here from Georgetown. I was so sorry I had to miss the conference yesterday. One of my PhD students, my academic children, was graduating, and I had to present her with her hood. So that seemed like an unmissable event. But I'm so pleased to be here in this beautiful setting with all of these fantastic people from diverse backgrounds from all over the world. I really was so impressed listening to Mary tell me about everybody's backgrounds. The talk I give is fairly interdisciplinary. It draws from lots of different areas of psychology and neuroscience. So hopefully if there are any questions about anything I'm presenting about, you'll have a chance to ask them at the end. We should have lots of time for questions. And I also want to, before I start, just thank the amazing audiovisual crew here. They are the best audiovisual crew. They had to try many things to get my presentation up and running today, and they did not quit until it worked. So a huge thanks to them. I want to start today with a short story. It was 1996, and I was 19 years old and driving back to my home in Tacoma, Washington, down the Interstate 5 freeway, when a dog ran across the road in front of me. And I did what many of us would do and none of us should do, which is swerve to avoid it, which sent my car spinning out of control and stranded me in the fast lane of the freeway with no way to escape and this freeway full of cars and trucks and semis bearing down on me. Within minutes, I'm not exactly sure how long. If you've ever been in a true emergency situation, you know that time sort of compresses and stretches out in weird ways. But a stranger appeared next to my car. I don't know anything about him except he looked a little bit like the actor Idris Elba. I don't think he was the actor Idris Elba, because that would have been even cooler. But that's all I know about him, is that's what he looked like. And I've realized later that what he had done is pulled his own car over on the other side of the street and run across 5 lanes of freeway traffic in the dark to reach me. And he got my car up and running again, and he got me back to safety. He offered to follow me home in case I was too shaky to make it. And when I tried politely to refuse his offer. He said, "All right, you take care of yourself." And off he went. He disappeared. I never learned his name even. I don't even think I got a chance to thank him. And so what happened to me that night left me with this colossal puzzle that I've spent the last 20 years trying to solve, which is, why is it that people sometimes take risks and make sacrifices to help people who are complete strangers to them? So in other words, what is the origin of altruism? Altruism being any voluntary, costly behavior, the goal of which is to improve the welfare of another person. And today I'll be telling you about the behavioral and the brain imaging research that I've been conducting that's aimed at identifying the roots of altruistic motivation and behavior. Altruistic behaviors include behaviors like heroic rescues, like the one that saved my life. I think also the teenage boy at the bottom there is a Canadian teenager who a few years ago saved a woman on a bus from kidnapping because he noticed how terrified she looked and took it upon himself to rescue her. They also include donations of money and clothes and shoes and blood and even organs like kidneys. And acts like these have for a long time represented a real puzzle for scientists because they can't be explained using either of the two sort of classic biological explanations that root altruism in self-interest. One being kin selection, which is a thing that happens, right? It's the desire to help your own genetic kin. It's not a conscious desire to help your genetic kin. I mean, prairie dogs and bats do it too. But most species prefer to help genetic kin because that helps their own genes in the long run, and so it is ultimately self-interested. And then there is also reciprocal altruism, which is helping members, usually of one's own group, who have helped you in the past and who you anticipate will help you in the future. But when altruism is spontaneous and costly and anonymous, and it only yields concrete benefits for a stranger, even most psychological explanations that root altruism and self-interest also fail. Things like reputation enhancement or even getting a thank you, which again, I think my own altruist failed to get. So you start running out of possibilities that altruistic acts like these are motivated by anything other than genuine care. There just really isn't much left. Now, sometimes we term care phrases like concern or compassion. You note that I really try to avoid using the word empathy in a scientific context as much as I can. It's not because I don't believe in empathy. Obviously, I believe it's important, and it actually is the core of much of what I talk about. But at least among psychologists and neuroscientists, the word empathy has come to mean so many different things that people get in a lot of arguments about whether it's good or bad, or whether it's present or absent in a given situation. That's almost always because they're talking about two different forms of empathy. I've actually argued recently that what we really should refer to is the empathies, because different processes within the brain underlie different forms of empathy, and some of them can be intact while others of them are defective, and vice versa, and I'll talk about that more as we go on. Okay, so saying that altruism can be motivated by concern or compassion doesn't really get us that far in terms of explaining it. That's more or less just saying sometimes we help people because we want to help them. It's sort of a tautology. The bigger questions are, where does the capacity to experience true other-oriented care come from? Right? I believe that the data I'll be presenting in a moment will provide clear evidence that we must, as a species, it is impossible that we as a species do not have the capacity to experience true other-oriented care. We clearly do. And again, I think you'll be convinced by the data I present in favor of that. And not everybody believes this, believe me, I know. But so what fascinates me about that is that, any psychological phenomenon, right, any feeling or thought or memory or desire or motivation, all of that is reflected in some process that happens within the brain, right? There isn't anything that is an experience or a thought or any psychological outcome that doesn't have some clear neural process that underlies it. And so that is the core of my research, is what is the process within the brain, this alchemical sort of miracle that provides us with the capacity for care. And why do some people seem to have more of it than others? And of course, the really big ticket question is, can it be increased? I will say that I was so delighted to meet Mary for many reasons at a conference recently, which led to my being here today. But one of it is because when I was doing the research for my book on ways that we can increase empathy and care and compassion in the world, I came to the conclusion that there are probably 2, maybe 3 proven ways to actually increase care and compassion, and Roots of Empathy is one of them. It's one of the best programs in the world as far as I'm concerned. And some of the data I'll be presenting hopefully will give a little insight into one of the reasons it is such an effective program from a neuroscience perspective. Okay, so these are really big, thorny questions about really big, abstract concepts. And a really classical approach to answering questions like these about complex, abstract psychological processes like intelligence or memory or emotion is a clinical approach, right? You find a population in whom whatever thing you're interested in is missing. And so that's the approach I actually started out using to try to understand the capacity for care and altruism. I started out by studying psychopaths, or to be more precise, children who have psychopathic personality traits. This is the reason that I often get asked about Donald Trump. Who I'm happy to say, my house is not that close to the White House, but it's too close for my preference. Okay. So there's a lot of misinformation out there about psychopathy. It's a very sensationalistic topic. I've learned that if I want to stop a conversation completely at a party or something, I just tell people I'm a psychology professor. No one wants to talk after that. But if I want to keep the conversation going, I say I study psychopaths. It's an interesting topic, right? We want to know about this population of people who seem so devoid of care and compassion that they can do things that most people would consider horrifying. But I do want to clear up a few misconceptions about psychopathy. In brief, people who are psychopathic, and I actually have come to try to avoid using the term psychopath as much as possible too, and this is because clinicians have stopped I'm not a clinician myself, but I do a lot of clinically relevant work. We've stopped referring to patient populations in terms of their disorder, right? We used to use words like schizophrenics and anorectics and depressives, right? We don't use those words anymore. We say people with depression or people with schizophrenia. So I actually believe, and I think the evidence is clear, that psychopathy is a clinical disorder. And especially when you work with children with this condition, they didn't ask to be this way. And so I really have tried to avoid using the word psychopaths other than when I need to for shorthand. I prefer using the word people who are psychopathic. They do engage in persistent antisocial behavior, and they show dramatically reduced concern and care for other people's suffering. That's the core of psychopathy. That's what sets them apart even from other antisocial populations. It's a true deficit in caring about others. It's not that it's buried underneath somewhere, and if we could only sort of get around their sort of woundedness, we could get to that core of care and compassion. It doesn't seem to be there. There's no evidence that it is there. There's no true DSM equivalent to it for anybody who has clinical background. The closest thing is antisocial personality disorder, but that disorder has gotten watered down over the years a lot to strip out most of the stuff relevant to psychopathy. The best analog is conduct disorder in children with what's called a limited prosocial emotion specifier, and children who have that classification are essentially children with psychopathic traits. Okay, psychopathic traits are also developmental. This means that essentially all adults who are psychopathic started out as children or adolescents with psychopathic traits, and these traits persist over time. Not 100%, right? Nothing persists 100% over time, but psychopathy is a personality disorder, and personality tends to be somewhat sticky over time. This makes sense given how highly heritable psychopathy is. It has a heritability coefficient that's about 0.6, maybe higher. That means that 60% of the variation in psychopathic traits is attributable to genetic factors. There's a very common misconception that psychopathy is sort of caused simply by childhood trauma or abuse or neglect, and these things certainly contribute to many seriously deleterious outcomes in children. They definitely make children who have the who are at high risk for psychopathy worse, but they're not a simple cause of psychopathy in any meaningful way. What is true is that the risk factors for psychopathy combine to change how the brain develops in characteristic ways that seem to rob people with these traits of the capacity for care. And the most consistently identified deficit in people who are psychopathic is dysfunction in the amygdala. The structure is involved in lots of different emotional and social processes, but it's not necessary for very many. One of the things it is necessary for is fear. And an intact amygdala has been linked to performance in lots of fear-related tasks. And so for quite a long time, we suspected amygdala dysfunction in psychopathic children. Many people now consider it a disorder of the amygdala. Children with these traits don't respond appropriately to punishment. This is one of the reasons that you can't punish people with serious antisociality that's psychopathic into behaving, because how does punishment work? And I don't mean, cruel punishment. I mean anything, like I'll take away your phone. I know many children would call that cruel, but, we would normally consider that a reasonable punishment for misbehavior. And the way that punishment works, and this is just classic behaviorism, is the person knows when they're threatened with punishment that this bad thing will happen if they do the wrong thing, and they fear that punishment. Not in a huge sense, right? Not in a sort of existential terror sense, but that is a fear response. It's anticipating some sort of punishment. If you don't have the capacity to experience fear, punishment has no effect on you. You don't like it when you get it, but you don't fear it in advance of it. They don't show any physiological changes in response to threat or punishment. They don't show fear-potentiated startle, all the classic markers of amygdala functioning. But the first direct evidence for amygdala dysfunction in psychopathy was collected by my lab when I was a postdoc at the NIMH in DC. In this task, we showed adolescents who were psychopathic photographs of people who looked fearful or angry or just were showing neutral expressions, and we compared them to children who were healthy and children who had ADHD. And we found that psychopathic adolescents showed reduced amygdala responsiveness to fearful facial expressions and only fearful expressions relative to controls. Right? We didn't see any differences for angry expressions, but they show this real deficit in amygdala responses to fear. We've replicated this finding many times, as have other labs. This graph shows data collected by one of my graduate students, Leah Lozier, who found a continuous decline in amygdala responsiveness in response to facial expressions of fear as psychopathic traits increase. And we also found that it is specifically low amygdala activity in response to other people's fear that statistically mediates the relationship between psychopathy and the callous kind of aggression that's most closely linked to it, which is proactive or goal-directed aggression. That's the most worrisome kind of aggression. Lots of people engage in reactive aggression. You've threatened me, I feel frustrated, and I sort of lash out in a temper, right? That's very common. I mean, essentially all 2-year-olds engage in that kind of aggression, and lots of different clinical disorders are associated with it. Proactive aggression, sort of cool, I want this from you, and I don't care if I have to hurt you to get it. That kind of aggression is linked to only one clinical condition, which is psychopathy. And so the fact that low amygdala responsiveness to signs of other people's distress mediates the psychopathy-proactive aggression relationship suggests that maybe amygdala hypoactivation to fearful expressions represents an intermediate phenotype or a biomarker in some ways for psychopathic traits, and suggests the possibility that whatever the amygdala is doing in response to other people's fear is somehow intrinsic to the capacity to care. One of the reasons is that amygdala dysfunction seems to impair the ability of people who are psychopathic to even recognize other people's fear, right? They see an expression like this and they literally draw a blank. We've known this for a while. My colleague Essie Viding in the UK was running a facial expression recognition task in a series of adult inmates in the UK. And one of the psychopathic inmates she was testing missed every single fearful facial expression he saw, which is pretty bad, even for somebody who's psychopathic. And he knew he was doing badly. And he got to the last fearful expression and he said, you know, I don't know what that expression is called, but I know that's what people look like right before you stab them. Right? So he's like, yeah, I've seen that face before. I know I've seen it, and I can even tell you when I've seen it. But he couldn't come up with the emotion that that face in that circumstance represents. But it's a really serious deficit, and hopefully this is a good indicator of why I consider this a real disability, right? It's a real illness. And so obviously that's just anecdotal evidence, but what the quote suggests was confirmed by a meta-analysis I conducted that compiled data from across 20 previous studies and found that psychopathy selectively impairs the ability to recognize other people's fear. Right? Again, not other emotions. This is why I refer to the empathies, right? The ability to recognize other people's fear is distinct from the ability to recognize their anger or the ability to recognize their happiness. These are somewhat correlated abilities, but far from perfectly correlated abilities. You can be good at one and not at others. This is important because simply recognizing somebody else's emotional state, right? You're having a feeling, it shows on your face, I detect it, and I'm able to interpret it somehow, right? I recognize that state you're feeling is the most fundamental form of empathy. And so what these findings suggest is that amygdala dysfunction may prevent people who are psychopathic from recognizing when others are in distress, which is why they may fail to respond appropriately with care when they see it, right? If you don't even recognize that that person's in distress, why would you be motivated to respond any particular way? Now, these problems may all spring from gross anatomical abnormalities in the amygdala. A number of studies have now found that psychopathic adults and adolescents have amygdalas that are smaller than average. These are data from a sample of about 80 adolescents we scanned where we found a really clear negative relationship between psychopathic traits and the size of the amygdala, with some of the most psychopathic kids having amygdalas that were about 30% smaller than the least psychopathic, which is a really big difference. And when you're doing brain anatomy studies and you can actually just see the difference with the naked eye between your top and your bottom quartile, that's a really big difference. And the regression analyses we ran found that this was very specific to the callous and uncaring traits associated with psychopathy. When we controlled for all kinds of other variables, including age and gender and cognitive ability, and even how severe their aggression was, it's really just the low levels of care and concern that these children show that seems to be linked to their low amygdala volume. Okay. So the reason that we call these variations in the psychopathic brain abnormalities is because by definition they're not normal, they're rare in the general population, thank goodness. One study in the UK tested hundreds of adults using a psychopathy screening instrument and found that psychopathic traits are continuously but not normally distributed in the population, and those are both important features of the distribution. Another reason we try to avoid using the word psychopath is it suggests that psychopaths are this group of people over here and then all the rest of us are over here and we're all sort of the same, which is not true. Psychopathic traits vary on a spectrum from very high to very low, but again, they don't vary normally. Instead, you see this sort of half normal distribution, so that most of the population, maybe 70%, again in this UK sample, had no psychopathic traits at all, and only a very small fraction, maybe 1%, fully meets the criteria for being what forensic psychologists would call a psychopath. And that is a term that's used a lot in forensic psychology. I should say that estimates of the prevalence of psychopathy vary a little bit across countries. It does seem to be higher in the US than it does in other countries. In fact, the cutoff for being a psychopath in the US is higher than it is in the UK, and there seem to be many more people who exceed that cutoff for various reasons. Okay, so what does that mean? A couple things. First, it means that 70% of the population is not at all psychopathic. They're not at all Machiavellian. They're not at all callous, which it doesn't just suggest. It requires that the majority of people definitely has the capacity to genuinely care for other people because they're not psychopathic. That's actually the most optimistic thing I think about doing this kind of research. This is why I believe that it must be true that the typical person truly has the capacity to care for other people. Because if they didn't, there wouldn't be any such a thing as somebody who's psychopathic. We'd just all be the same, right? Just some of us better at covering it up than others. And by the way, interestingly, this is what people who are psychopathic believe. My hometown of Tacoma, Washington is the hometown of multiple really notorious serial killers who are also psychopathic, including Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer and the DC Sniper. There were at least 4 serial killers operating in Tacoma when I was growing up there. I don't know what to say. I don't live there anymore. But it's a lovely town. And now, the really sort of just optimistic thing about this is that that is different than the rest of us, right? The rest of us must have the capacity for genuine care, or there wouldn't be any such thing as those people, right? They didn't. Oh, I was getting back to the point that Ted Bundy is famous for saying that he believed that nobody really had the capacity to care. He believed that everybody was just like him. It's just that some people were better at covering it up than others, right? And that's their blindness, right? If you've never felt the capacity for true love, which people who are psychopathic also don't feel, it would be impossible to imagine, right? And it's sort of sad, actually, when you think about it. Okay. I realize it only gets us so far as saying that most of the population is not psychopathic. That's not a huge compliment. But 70% of the population is a lot of people, and this strange sort of half-normal distribution suggests that maybe the psychopathy scale is not capturing all the possible variants in the human capacity for care and compassion. Maybe there's this whole other half of the distribution that's not being captured of people who are not just not psychopathic, but the opposite of psychopathic, people who exhibit more than the usual amount of care for other people, and instead of engaging in extreme antisocial behavior, engage in extreme prosocial and caring behavior. And so my group has now spent the last 8 or so years conducting research with people who I do think fit the definition of an anti-psychopath. We also call them extraordinary altruists. These people have all volunteered to undergo surgery to give a complete stranger their own kidney. I don't know how much you know about altruistic kidney donation. I always like to talk about it a little bit because you just never know who out there will find this an interesting idea. So I should start by saying it's a tremendously needed thing. In the US, there's something like 100,000 people who are currently on the waiting list to receive a kidney, right, who are in end-stage kidney failure. There are only about 10,000 deceased donor organs available every year, and something like 1 in 5 people who are on the waiting list will die every year waiting for a kidney. Most of us have 2 healthy kidneys and could live perfectly fine with just 1. In order to donate a kidney to a stranger, you do have to go through a lot of testing, lots of medical and psychiatric screening. You can't receive any compensation. And most people who donate kidneys to strangers know going into the donation that they may never meet their recipient. It's not a terribly dangerous surgery compared to other surgeries. The risk of death from surgery is something like 1 in 3,000. But it's not 0, right? That's actually higher than the risk of death from skydiving. And the risk of experiencing really excruciating pain during recovery is nearly 100%. It's short-lived, but the recovery period is tricky. So like my roadside rescue, what I find interesting about altruistic kidney donation is it's very difficult to explain why somebody would go through all of this to donate a kidney to somebody they've never met and may never meet as anything other than altruism motivated by care, right? There isn't any other good explanation. So my goal is to try to understand what it is that makes these altruists do what they do, because that could really help us better understand the basis of the human capacity for care. Okay, so why do altruists donate? For the most part, people have answered this question in the past by just asking the donors themselves, and they give a variety of explanations. They're not a completely homogeneous population in almost any way, although the answers that they give about why they donated do tend to boil down to some very common themes. Here's one example. So here's the big AV test. Will this video play? And will there be audio? Why don't you think more people donate? And I'm playing with fire, but I'm going to pause it real quick. I should mention as context, he's talking to my graduate student who's interviewing him, with me mostly just laughing in the background.
Ignorance, not ignorance as in stupid, but ignorance as in not asking the right questions or not having the right dominoes fall at the right time. My favorite part is people say, oh, I could never do that. Oh, that's bullshit. That's absolutely bullshit, because I'll go through a series of questions. Would you give to your mother to save her life? And of course, 99, I always write this, I'll write 4 letters on my hand. Okay, would you give to your mom? Would you give to your mom if she were dying?
Yes.
Why?
Because she's my mom.
Stop. That's the 4 letters I write down. BS, because she's my mom, is what everybody says. It's universal. Okay, so we got that. So you would never do what I do, but you do it for your mom. Okay, how about your sister or your brother? And I extend it. How about your best friend that's not related? How about your teacher or your boss? She's not even looking at you. She can't see you. If she was going to die next week and you're the only person, don't say anything out loud, but you think to yourself, really, she's going to die? So you start weighing what's priority. Yes, my rent is due. This is priority. This is health. This is life and death situations. And so people quickly go, I could never do that, and I just don't believe that because your life's not been thrown into a situation that makes you make these kinds of decisions. So again, I keep coming back to my favorite part is I think we all are capable of doing this. It's easy to say no, but when you're faced with a situation, yes, I raise my hand and look for the situation, but I know why I did that. But when it push comes to shove, she very well might, or somebody in your circle might do that because they don't want you to die. It's pretty simple.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
So their answers almost universally boil down to some variation on, I wanted to help somebody who was suffering, or helping somebody just was the right thing to do, or the most common is it was just the obvious thing to do, right? They're gonna die, I can live without my kidney, why wouldn't I help them? They think that the decision to donate a kidney is just as obvious and just as sort of clear as most people think the decision not to donate a kidney is, right? Most people think that altruistic kidney donation is the thing that needs explaining, but what I think is interesting is that the donors think the decision not to donate is what needs explaining. Okay. At another level, though, maybe their behavior can be explained through the hypothesis that people who make enormous sacrifices to help other people are somehow engineered to be the opposite of people who are psychopathic. So whereas people who are psychopathic are characterized by hypoactive amygdala responses to fear, poor ability to recognize others' fear and distress, and a smaller than average amygdala, maybe extraordinary altruists will show heightened amygdala responses to others' fear, better ability to recognize it, and maybe larger amygdala volume as well. And so we tested this hypothesis by bringing 19 altruistic kidney donors to Georgetown from all over the country for MRI scanning, and we compared them to 20 local controls we matched on every variable we could think of: sex and race and handedness and age and IQ and education level, etc. I should mention that one interesting variable that cropped up we didn't expect is that we did find that altruists are more likely to come from some parts of the country than others. In the US, we actually do have several Canadian donors as well, but this is just the US sample. When we looked at the national pool of all altruistic kidney donors, just to make sure that our little sample was sort of similar demographically, we discovered that some states produce many more altruistic kidney donors than others per capita. States like Utah, states in New England, with states in the Southeast generally low. So why would this be? As it happened, when we looked at these data, the Gallup polling organization had for the first time come out with a map of well-being across the 50 United States. And when we plotted the maps of well-being and kidney donation per capita against each other, the correspondence across the two was really striking, even after accounting for all the other variables that differ across states. And so what we found is that it seemed to be the case that when things are going well in a region, right, people are flourishing, their health is good, and they perceive that things are getting better. They report a higher level of subjective well-being, and that seems to be associated with the increase in extraordinary altruism, which I think contradicts a somewhat popular notion that when people are flourishing, it makes them more selfish. Wouldn't that be a terrible Faustian bargain if it were true? But it doesn't seem to be. Particularly because we have brand new global data looking at well-being across the world, and altruistic, we didn't look at altruistic kidney donations because interestingly it's not legal most places in the world. You cannot give a kidney to a stranger most places. But we did look at living kidney donations between other kinds of pairs. And we found the same pattern between well-being and other kinds of kidney donation: charitable donations, volunteering, everyday helping, blood donation, marriage donation, animal welfare. And when they're all put together, it's an incredibly strong relationship between people's subjective sense of thriving and flourishing and wanting to help other people, even accounting for all the other demographic variables that we could think of. Okay. Back to our study. So we ran our altruistic kidney donors through some pretty exhaustive testing. I won't detail it here. Just as a few highlights, we didn't find much difference in most of the self-report scales. This is mostly because most self-report scales of empathy are not that good. They're too transparent. People who are very altruistic also tend to be very humble, and so they tend to underreport how caring they are, interestingly. We did find a difference in one of the major psychopathy subscales, with altruistic kidney donors being less psychopathic than controls, so that's good. But all in all, none of these tests were great predictors of altruism. So how about our neural measures? Our first scan directly replicated the task that we used to show reduced amygdala activity in psychopathic kids, and in contrast to them, we found that altruists show increased activity in the right amygdala to other people's fear relative to controls. And again, this was only for fear. We didn't find any similar response to anger, which suggests they're not generally anxious. People who are just anxious show heightened amygdala responses to everything, happiness, anger, fear, whatever, right? But if it's just in response to fear, something else is going on, and I'll get to what that something else is in a moment. We also found some support that this enhanced activation supports better recognition of fear. We ran an emotion recognition task outside the scanner and found that increased amygdala responses to fear in the scanner predicts a better ability to recognize other people's distress, with altruists overrepresented in the upper right quadrant. And the donors were relatively better at recognizing fear relative to controls as well, but they were actually worse at recognizing anger. That's really interesting because heightened sensitivity to other people's anger is associated with what's called hostile attribution bias, misperceiving ambiguous or sort of low-level cues as anger, and that leads most people to respond angrily back. And so it's actually really good to have kind of a high threshold for detecting anger in other people. But again, what we see is that people who are altruistic have particularly high sensitivity to the fearful facial expression, which is so interesting because this is an expression that tends to elicit concern and care in people who see it. And as the deficits we saw in psychopathy reflect anatomical differences, the same seems to be true in altruists. In altruists, the right amygdala had 8% more gray matter volume than in controls, whereas we didn't find any differences in nearby subcortical structures like the hippocampus. And the amygdala differences persisted even after we controlled for the fact that altruists also have just bigger brains overall, which we did not predict. It's just like they're just better people in every way. But even after we controlled for that, their amygdalas were still bigger. And so these data support the idea that individual variation in empathy and care can be measured on a sliding scale. People are not all identical, right? Thank goodness for that. How boring would life be if we were, right? And this is even true when it comes to, quote unquote, human nature. This is the focus of a recent review I wrote in the Annual Review of Psychology. I think there's something a little bit insidious about believing that human nature is all the same. And there's some good things about that. I can see why people want to believe this, but I think the bad thing about it is that if you really believe that we are all equal in our capacity for care and compassion, and then you see somebody do something really awful, right? A serial killer gets arrested and has killed dozens of people, right? Or one of these awful recent attacks that we've seen, which is not driven by psychopathy, I should mention. Usually those are driven by something else. When that happens, if you believe that we all are the same in terms of our capacity for care and compassion, then you believe that we are all capable of that. Any one of us is capable of doing something like that. And I want to tell you, it's just not true. Most of us are not capable of doing something like that, right? It leads to real cynicism. That is why people get cynical. They believe that human nature is all basically the same. They see one terrible thing happen in their world. They're like, people are terrible. I'm like, no. Like, that person's clearly terrible. They did something terrible, But that doesn't say anything about the rest of us. In fact, it really just highlights how different we really all are. Extraordinary altruists seem to represent the inverse of psychopathy, and this is also, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, that this is also not the case that altruism and care and compassion are static. These are of course, capacities that can be increased. But people who are very altruistic seem to represent the inverse of psychopathy in terms of their neural responsiveness to fear, the anatomical structure of the amygdala, and these data support the idea that there is a neurobiological basis for altruism, just as there's a neurobiological basis for the kinds of dysfunction we see in psychopathy. And that whatever is going on in the brains of very altruistic people shapes their sensitivity to other people's distress, in particular their fear, and suggests that sensitivity to other people's fear and distress, distress is sort of an umbrella term, with fear being the most salient, acute kind of distress, represents sort of an intermediate phenotype or a biomarker for individual differences in caring. And it really is. I've done lots and lots of studies showing that one of the strongest predictors of individual differences in the capacity for care is how sensitive you are to other people's fear. So that said, these preliminary findings left us with many questions. Some of the ones that stood out for me that I'll just answer briefly, and these are the questions people often ask me, include, why is it responses to fearful expressions in particular that are linked to care and altruism? Like, why not pain or sadness? Also, why, if altruists have such robust amygdala responses to fear, are they not overcome by their own fear in the face of danger? And finally, why is it that the altruists that we study respond not just to the fear of people close to them, but to the fear of people they've never met, right? That's what's really unusual about them, is how responsive they are to the distress of strangers. Okay, so looking at the first question, why fear, right? Why would responses to this expression be so tightly connected to the capacity for care? I mean, the first answer is they just are, like just empirically they are. I find it over and over again. But in terms of the reasons, one is that these expressions consistently elicit care and concern in people who see them. So even when you present them subliminally, they increase people's self-reported care and concern. So it makes sense that sensitivity to them would be linked to variation in care. So why do they elicit care? In part because they're perceived as being very affiliative, as desiring social connection. They're rated as being almost as affiliative as happy expressions, interestingly. They also elicit approach, behavioral approach in people who see them. This is in direct opposition to the idea that a fearful expression is some sort of a threat cue. They're not. When we do these behavioral approach avoidance tasks where we have people push a lever away from them or pull it toward them in response to different expressions, people can pull the lever toward them more quickly in response to fear than they can push it away from them, which is consistent with a predominantly approach-related response. And we find that in typical samples, the more caring somebody's personality, the less psychopathic, the stronger their approach response is to fearful expressions, with this tendency being the most pronounced in extraordinary altruists, who respond much more strongly with approach to fear than they do to controls, and whereas we don't see the same patterns for pain or anger. So why would fearful expressions elicit approach? It may result from the basic appearance of fearful facial expressions. Several of the studies I've conducted now suggest that fearful expressions look the way they do, and they look this way all around the world. Like fearful expressions are an innate sort of human behavior, right? You don't have to learn to express fearful expressions. You don't have to learn to recognize them, right? There's something that we seem built with a capacity for. And so one of the very earliest questions I asked is, well, what makes them look the way they do? Why did they evolve to look this way? Several studies I've conducted suggest they look the way they do because they make a person look more infantile. Right? If you wanted to make an adult face more closely resemble a baby's face, you couldn't do much better than looking afraid, right? Wide eyes, raised brows, and sort of this rounded mouth and jaw region. And so they may have evolved to mimic the appearance of an infantile face. And consistent with this, in these approach avoidance studies that my student Jenny Hammer and I ran, we found the same pattern of responses to infants' faces as we did to fearful expressions. And so this is a huge, important clue about care. And again, why I think the Roots of Empathy program is so effective, is that this expression that consistently elicits care, right, the responses to which even seem to serve as a biomarker for care, resembles an infant's face. Because it really nicely dovetails with this idea that in mammals, the capacity for all kinds of care emerge out of the ancient systems that support parenting, caring for infants. And the best evidence that this is true comes from a recent study of primate species, 15 different primate species. Don't look at chimpanzees for clues about human behavior for the most part, right? They're really not a very good analog. Bonobos are much better. And even like little species like tamarins are actually pretty good analogs. If you look across primate species, the single best predictor of how much altruism adults of a primate species show towards one another is how much alloparental care they provide. Parental care that they provide not just for their own babies, but for others' babies. All mammals care for their own babies. A very precious few mammal species will provide care for other people's babies. And the capacity to care for other people's babies, the desire to care for other people's babies, the skill to care for other people's babies is the root of altruism. It really is, right? That is what seems to open up the floodgates, the capacity for care that can be spread far and wide. And again, it's a capacity that very few species have, right? Lots of animals will care for their own babies, but alloparenting is rare. And so this is why you also see altruism in a very few species. You'll see it in most species of dogs. Dogs are great alloparents. You'll even see it in lions. I don't know if you've ever seen those crazy examples of female lions that have been observed caring for baby oryxes and baby baboons and things. Why? I mean, they're fierce hunters. Well, the capacities for aggression and altruism are not at opposite ends of a spectrum, right? Aggression is oftentimes altruistic, right? Aggression is often designed to protect those that we love. But what's interesting about lions is that they are an alloparental species. Female lionesses will care for each other's cubs. And so this is the reason that caring instinct can be tripped in response to anything that reminds them a little bit of a baby. And baby oryxes and baby baboons are exactly that kind of species. Another reason that the parental link is important is because it brings us back to the amygdala, which is not just responsive to fearful stimuli, but is also the entry point into the parental care system. It's very densely populated with receptors for a neurotransmitter called oxytocin that regulates parental care. And so this fact may be essential for answering our second key question, which is, once altruists have picked up on somebody else's fear, how do they manage their own fear? Why don't they just get scared and flee the threat? So why, in other words, are people who are so sensitive to fear willing to do something so brave, right? Willing to risk pain and disability and a small chance of death to help somebody who's a stranger? And I think this quote may help provide the answer. As Nelson Mandela said, "I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man or woman is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear." So fear is actually an essential ingredient for courage. If you don't have the capacity for fear, you're just fearless. You're not actually brave. True bravery requires understanding the danger and acting anyhow in the service of something that's more important. And the ability to overcome fear for one's own self in the face of danger in the service of something or someone more important is the essence of parental care. And a really cool study was published last year that laid out for the first time how it is that parents, or mothers in particular, because again, in most species, there's no paternal care, right? That's not a thing. Again, in a few species it is. Tamarins are a good example. But in rats, the mothers are the only ones who do much caretaking. And this is a study that found for the first time how it is that mother rats will overcome their own fear for themselves when their offspring are in danger, which provide us with a bit of a roadmap for care-based altruism more generally. And what the study found is that altruistic care in the face of danger relies on oxytocin receptors in the amygdala. So in this study, these poor little mother rats were trained to fear an odor. They were conditioned to fear an odor. It was the smell of peppermint as it happened. When they smelled the peppermint, they would get a shock to their feet in this study. And then the experimenters tested their responses to it. And you can see in the light gray bar that these mother rats did what rats usually do in response to a threat, was that they freeze, right? That's a classic self-protective response. You're just trying to avoid being seen. And this response is orchestrated by the amygdala in connection with a really primitive structure called the periaqueductal gray. But you can kind of see this like dark gray line along the bottom too. I mean, you can barely see it because it's basically at zero. Another group of mother rats who were not freezing at all. Right, so who were these dams who resisted freezing in the face of threat? They were dams whose pups were in the enclosure with them at the time. So what were they doing? They were trying to protect their pups. Depending on the age of the pups, it was really cute, I'll show you a video. They either tried to block the tube that the smell was coming from, or they would huddle over their babies. Literally, that classic movement of trying to physically protect them from danger. They were being brave. Here's what that looks like. Right, so you can see that the dams alone, as soon as they smell the peppermint smell, they just freeze. That's a basic amygdala-mediated response. But the dams with pups get to work. It's not that they haven't detected the danger. They've definitely detected the danger, but they overcome fear for their own well-being and this self-preservative behavior to try to protect their pups instead. Either try to keep that mean smell from coming in the cage, or if their pups were a little bit more adventurous, trying to drag them all back to the nest and protect them with their own bodies. Rats are wonderful mothers, by the way. I mean, I've done a little rat research for my book, and I have a whole new respect for rats. Mother rats will forego food, even if they're hungry, and forego water if they're thirsty to get to their pups. They'll cross electrified grids to get to their pups, and they're good alloparents. They'll do all the same behavior for pups they've never met before. Okay. So what's neat is that the authors also determined that the amygdala was the locus of the mother rat's courage, specifically oxytocin receptors in the amygdala, because when they injected an oxytocin antagonist into the amygdala, the mother rats reverted to freezing in the face of danger again, even when their pups were there. They sort of lost their courage, which almost certainly reflects changes in signaling between amygdala and PAG, which regulates freezing. And so I think what's going on is that somehow oxytocin receptors within the amygdala are the source of care in response to other people's distress. What happens is that when you are confronted with somebody in distress whose distress cues trigger that parental response, either because they actually are a baby or because something about the way that their features get reconfigured by, for example, a fearful expression make them look more like a baby, right? Or maybe you've heard their voice. You know how our voices get higher pitched when we're afraid? Well, what does that sound like? It sounds more like a baby, right? That stimulates oxytocin production in the hypothalamus, and when that oxytocin arrives in the amygdala, it's like it sort of switches the track of behavior like a train in a rail yard, away from focusing on yourself and toward focusing on this other person who is in danger. I really think that is probably what's going on. We don't have evidence for it yet quite in humans, right? Here's a problem. With fMRI, we can't get anywhere near this level of sensitivity, right? But that is what we wanted to know. Is this what's going on in the brains of altruists when they discover someone's in danger? Right? After the amygdala detects somebody else's fear, is crosstalk with PAG regulating help versus escape? Again, we can't measure or manipulate oxytocin in the amygdala in humans, but we can measure the interplay between amygdala and PAG, where we know the oxytocin circuits are critical for regulating care and probably care-based altruism. And so we wanted to ask, can the amygdala's connections with PAG help explain why altruists respond to other people's fear the way that they do, with protective, caring behaviors rather than self-preservation? So to answer this question, we took a couple approaches. We first used an approach that measures white matter tracts in the brain to image the connections between the amygdala and the PAG and altruistic controls. And this little orange cluster you see is a region in which altruists and matched controls diverge in how strong the white matter connections are, with altruists showing, as you can see, significantly greater white matter connections between amygdala and PAG than controls. We also measured activity in amygdala and PAG while altruists were reporting how much sympathy they were experiencing, how much care they felt, following the presentation of subliminal fearful expressions. So we were flashing the fearful expressions at them so fast that they didn't even know that they were seeing them. And then we showed them a little scenario showing somebody in some sort of mild danger and asked how much sympathy they felt for that person. And our prior research has shown that just even these subliminal fearful expression primes reliably increase care and sympathy in this task. And our functional imaging results show that when the scenarios were preceded by subliminal fearful expressions compared to neutral expressions, altruist increases in care were associated with more activation in amygdala and PAG. That's what this blue slope shows here in the altruist. And the altruist showed significantly increased connections in crosstalk between amygdala and PAG. So when they're making caring decisions, these two regions that we know are responsible for regulating self-preservation versus active care are talking more. So it's really consistent. I mean, it's a very frustrating thing about doing human work is we're still sort of gnawing around the edges of the puzzle. But it's really consistent with the idea that care-based altruism leverages ancient parental care systems. Which helps us answer the final question is why respond to strangers' fear? Right? If parental care systems enable we mammals to override fear for ourselves to protect others, altruists must be responding to strangers' fear more like they respond to the fear of people close to them, like their own children. And we have very recent data suggesting that's true. And this is data from an empathic pain and fear response study where we brought altruistic kidney donors into the lab and wired them up to a device that inflicts painful pressure on their thumbnail during an fMRI scan. And then we measured their brain responses both when they experienced pain and when they were anticipating pain, which is fear, and also during the lead-up period. In addition, altruistic controls watched from the scanner as a stranger experienced identical epochs of fear and pain. And our first analysis compared activation maps when people were experiencing fear and pain themselves and watching somebody else experiencing fear and pain. And you can see that there's some overlapping controls during the two kinds of conditions, right? This is true empathy in action, right? The way that you feel when you are experiencing pain is represented in the brain very similarly, or at least somewhat similarly, to the way your brain responds when other people experience pain. But you can see that there's much more conjunction for altruists in both types of trials. Suggesting altruists show much more spontaneous, empathic mapping of other people's pain and anticipated pain. Right? They're representing other people's fear and pain much more similarly in the brain to their own. They really are sort of feeling others' pain in some sense. I will say that this response was not very closely linked to their self-reported empathy, the degree to which we saw empathic self-other mapping in the brain. What it was linked to was this really cool scale I like to use called the inclusion of self and other scale, which shows you two circles at different sort of points of distance or conjunction or overlap, and asks you to pick the ones that best represent how you feel about a relationship with somebody else. And it turns out that altruists feel more self-other overlap with strangers, right? They don't feel as distant from strangers as most people do. And that seems to be why they map the pain and fear of strangers much more similarly to the way they map their own fear and pain. They're literally using their own experiences to understand the pain and fear of others. Most people do this to some extent, but only for people they care about closely, people who are family members or friends or romantic partners. Okay. So together, the results of these studies suggest some answers to the questions we started with. What are the origins of care-based altruism? One is just the ability to recognize when others are in distress and need help, thanks to representations in the amygdala. The second is activity in ancient parental care networks that motivate us to provide that help in response to other people's distress rather than escaping. And the final one is the capacity to somehow manage to expand our circle of care outward, past not just people who are close to us, but way beyond that, even to strangers. And the fact that that clearly is possible, that there are systems in place that allow us to do this, that the circle of care can absolutely be expanded, is the optimistic message that I will close with today. So thank you very much.